Happy evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jayasuriya from Tagore Medical College. Here today to sharpen your ideas on vitamin B12 and vitamin B9, the continuation of our series of vitamins. Yeah. Now, this vitamin B9, let me start with vitamin B9. Now, this vitamin B9 is also called as folic acid, where the word folic acid in terms of Latin, it was derived in terms of Latin, the term of folium, which means leaf, and its isolated form of leafy vegetables, something like the spinach, and that's how the name came as folic acid. And this folic acid mainly consists of three components: the pteridine ring, PABA, and glutamic acid. PABA in the sense para-aminobutyric acid. Now, moving on to the dietary sources. What are all the dietary sources that are there that has got huge content of this folic acid? The rich sources goes something like the green leafy vegetable, as the name suggests, and something like the spinach, cauliflower, and so on. And poor sources are there, something like the liver, kidney, milk, and even the fruits. Now, this milk being a poor source of this folic acid, it also contains many other vitamins. So, milk adds upon in many of the lists, right? Let me directly move on to this required daily allowance, how much that has to be taken in case of a daily basis. It's something like 200 microgram per day is required for a normal human being, and in case of the pregnant and lactating women, sorry, it is about one. In case of lactating women, it is 200 microgram, and in case of one second, yeah, and in case of the yeah. In case of the lactating women and the pregnant women, it is required more than 200 microgram, and in case of the normal person, 200 microgram is sufficient as far as daily basis thing is concerned. Now, let me move on to the biochemical functions. Folic acid, I'll talk about the metabolism in the later part. This coming to this biochemical functions, the coenzyme form of folic acid, that is the active form, the so-called tetrahydrofolate, it's required for something called as one carbon metabolism as a carrier of various one carbon compounds. And these one carbon compounds are substances, something like they contain one carbon atom. To be more precise, the methyl group, the methynyl, the methylene, methynyl, formin, and four amino groups are some of the one carbon substances. Now, this tetrahydrofolate, the active form of the folic acid or the vitamin B9, acts as a carrier of these one carbon compounds and serves as an acceptor or donor of these one carbon compounds in various reactions, which which are collectively termed as something called as one carbon metabolism. Mainly important compounds are synthesized in this one carbon metabolism, something like the purines and the uh, something called as the deoxythymidyllic acid, uh, the so-called pyrimidine nucleotide, which is present in the DNA, and this purine is also present in the DNA and RNA. Whereas in terms of this purine, the second carbon and the eighth carbon of purine rings, which are formed by this folic acid. I mean, yeah, this folic acid, it is quite have is quite important in terms of this DNA synthesis, whereas this it supports for this purine formation and this deoxythymidine acid formation, and it also helps in many other reactions such as something like synthesis of glycine, serine, and even I guess ethanolamine and choline. I mean the choline. On the other hand, it is also required for the synthesis of something called as formyl methionine and in terms of this formyl methionine, the first amino acid is added during the protein synthesis itself. Now, all these things are quite deep into the biochemistry thing. I guess it would be quite hard for you people to understand, but these are the uh, something like the coenzyme forms. Coenzymes are nothing but the non-protein part of a non. I mean, the yeah, coenzymes are the non-protein part of the enzymes, uh, which has got a huge role in the body's metabolism and other pathways. Whereas enzymes play a key role in the reducing the activation energy and so on. Something like they fasten up the reactions that take place in our body, and they help in the most of the reactions. And other functions of this folic acid goes like something like it reduces the level of this homocysteine in the blood, and therefore it will be helping in preventing many of the heart diseases, something called as CV syndromes, that is cardiovascular syndromes. Multiple heart diseases are being reduced with the presence of this folic acid, where there is a conversion process of homocysteine to methionine and so on, and it prevents something like the birth defects, the so-called spina bifida and the anencephaly. Now, what is this anencephaly and spina bifida? These are nothing but the neural tube defects where when the baby is formed, due to the insufficiency of this folic acid or this vitamin D, B9 during the pregnancy. So generally, what happens is the spinal cord doesn't close, where uh, in the distal end of the uh, baby's back, uh, that is towards the caudal end, to be in medical terms, towards the caudal end. Uh, there is these. I mean, the spinal cord will not be closed, and in case of this anencephaly, the same thing happens in terms of this cranial end, that is towards the head side. Now, moving on to the metabolism part, yeah. Now, where it is absorbed in the small intestine, and oh, most of the dietary folic acids exist in the form of something called as polyglutamate, that is within 3 to 7 glutamate residues. And sorry, I mentioned it is absorbed in intestine, but it is not absorbed in intestine, where this glutamate side chains are cleaved by the enzyme, something called as the folate conjugate, and or something called as the uh, poly, the polyl polyglutamate hydrolase, quite deep into the biochemistry thing. And actually, this enzyme, folate conjugase, is present in the duodenum and the jejunum, that is the small bowel of our body. And there is something called as the mucosal uptake, and there takes place some chemical reaction. The metabolic reaction takes place in the mucosal cell, where this folate monoglutamate is taken up by this mucosal cell, and in this mucosal cell, this folate monoglutamate is reduced to something called as tetrahydrofolate, or the active form, and it is methylated to form something called as N-methyl tetrahydrofolate, which is there in the circulation. And this N-methyl tetrahydrofolate enters the circulation after passing this uh, after passing this cellular reaction. And now where does it get stored up? It gets stored up in the cells in the form of tetrahydrofolate, and something like the polyglutamates. These compounds are quite biologically most potent, and this generally this polyglutamate is the storage form of this tetrahydrofolate, and it is mainly stored in the liver. Around 10 to 20 milligrams is stored in the liver, which is quite different from the uh, other water soluble vitamins, where a huge amount is being stored in the liver in terms of this folic acid. And in terms of, I mentioned about this one carbon metabolism, and in terms of this absorption and excretion, as I mentioned earlier, it is stored in the liver, and in terms of the excretion, it is excreted through both the feces and through the urine. Now, the coenzyme form of this folic acid is there are three forms. Generally, it is called as three forms. One is the tetrahydrofolic acid, the other one is the folinic acid, and rhizopterin is the other form of the coenzyme form of this folic acid. Now, let me talk about what causes the deficiency of this folic acid, and what are all the oh, thereafter we'll look upon what are all the clinical features, that is what are all the symptoms and the signs that could be seen or sensed due to the deficiency of this vitamin B9. Yeah, generally in terms of this deficiency, dietary deficiency is the most common cause of this folic acid deficiency. And these dietary deficiencies are mainly caused by something like the inadequate intake that is seen in most of the alcoholics, and it also occurs due to the overcooking of the food, which results in the loss of the folic acid activity and impaired absorption due to the small intestinal diseases. And there are certain drugs that interfere with this folic acid absorption, something like the sulfametazole. Yeah, I think, it is. It is pronounced as sulfametazole, and there seems to be the increased demand for this folic acid during pregnancy, as I mentioned earlier, where the deficiency of this folic acid in case of this pregnant women causes the neural tube defects, and the deficiency causes another uh, another major thing, something called as the megaloblastic anemia. What is megaloblastic anemia? Megaloblastic anemia is nothing but the red blood cells, or anemia in terms, in simple terms, it is all anemia is termed as Ratta Sogai in Tamil colloquial term. Whereas, let me explain what is megaloblastic anemia. Megaloblastic anemia is nothing but when there is depletion of this vitamin B9. So generally, what happens? The contributing components, that is the purines and the pyrimidine, which I mentioned earlier, the deoxythymidyllic acid, and the other compound, that is the purine, which is mainly required for the synthesis of the DNA. Now, generally, the cell cycle has got something like the G phase, the G1 phase, G naught phase, G2 phase, and S phase, and so on, where the DNA replication takes place in this S phase. There is the so-called synthesis phase. That's quite deep into the biology. You would have read it in your class 12 and so on. Whereas in terms of this S phase, when there is lack of this purine and this deoxythymidyllic acid, which is required for the synthesis of the DNA. Now, generally, what happens when there is no synthesis of DNA? The cell starts shrinking. The cell size increases, the cytoplasmic size increases, and the nucleus size starts shrinking. That's why it's called as megaloblastic anemia. Generally, what happens? So this is one of the cause of the anemia. The megaloblastic anemia is one of the cause of the anemia. That is due to the deficiency of this folic acid. Hence, let's say that folic acid preparations are, I mean, yeah, there are other causes of this folic acid deficiency. Something like loss of folic acid is, folic acid will be lost in terms of this dialysis patient, where it is transported to the dialyzer, and the blood is being transported to the dialyzer, and there is this reaction taking place. This cleansing reaction taking place for the oxygenation and yeah, cleansing action taking place for the removal of the salts, the unwanted salts that are uh, there in the body, and the impaired synthesis of this active form is seen in patients receiving folic acid antagonists. So, generally, folic acid antagonist in this case is something like the methotrexate. And what could be seen? As I mentioned, the megaloblastic anemia could be seen where this megaloblastic anemia is characterized by hypochromic macrocytic anemia due to the maturation block. And this megaloblastic changes are seen in bone marrow and mucosa. Now, how does a patient look who has got megaloblastic anemia? They look pale, and will have other symptoms like something like the clubbing and so on. It's quite deep into the biology thing where the nails will be folded. It's termed as pyromygia. Yeah, and glossitis could be seen. What's glossitis? Glossitis is nothing but the injury of the tongue. That is nagapunnaidam. That is called as glossitis. Now, generally, what are the signs that could be seen in terms of this signs and symptoms that could be seen in folic acid deficiency? Poor growth could be seen, gingivitis, glossitis, loss of appetite, shortness of breath, diarrhea, irritability, and even patient may become, I mean, he might get forgetfulness, and the patient will be quite sluggish. Yeah, mental sluggishness could be very prominently seen, along with the neural tube defects, that is the anencephaly and the spinal bifida. Cleft palate is also seen in the babies due to this deficiency, and the brain damage could also be seen. Now, generally, the government PHCs are supplementing with prenatal folic acid supplementations in order to reduce these risk of folic acid deficiency, which might cause the neural tube defects and so on. Now, this folic acid supplements in early pregnancy is associated with something like the reduced risk of children having these defects. Now, low folate levels during this pregnancy will be associated with something like the emotional problems in the offspring. Something like, the patient will be facing, the child will be facing emotional problems. On the other hand, I was talking about this this homocystinuria, where where the cardiovascular syndrome is seen, especially this is seen in terms of this vitamin B9, vitamin B6, vitamin B12. Uh, when supplementations of these vitamins are taken, the risk of homocysteine level I mean, the risk of cardiovascular syndrome reduces as the homocysteine level is getting reduced due to the supplementation which is given. Yeah. This slide shows about the deficiency symptoms where you could see the megaloblastic anemia, where towards the left there is the normal red blood cell, and towards the right, the red blood cell has got bulged. The cell, I mean the partially matured red blood cell, that is the cells that are there in the bone marrow and in the mucosal cells. And this might even cause something like the, cancer. The folic acid supplements are never given to cancer patients since folic acid helps in the synthesis of purine ring and thymidine, that is the deoxythymidinic acid. Thus, DNA synthesis is so abnormal. Cell division occurs when there is increased risk of cancer. So, generally, what happens here is in terms of cancer, people, I mean, the patients who are at high risks of cancer, the folic acid supplementation is reduced, or they won't be prescribed with folic acid diet and so on. Now, let me move on to the vitamin B12. Yeah, here, where that you could see the neural tube defect where in the caudal end of the baby, there is protrusion of the spinal cord thing outside the body, where the neural tube has not yet closed. Yeah. Now, coming to the vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 consists of something called as a corin ring with a cobalt atom in its center. It is generally found as something like the methyl cobalamin or adenosyl cobalamin or hydroxocobalamin in animals. Now, it's quite interesting in terms of this sources of vitamin B12, where there is hardly any vegetable that has got source of vitamin B12, where there's a I mean, there is a great list in terms of this non-vegetarian thing, where the milk, pork, chicken, liver are the richest sources of this vitamin B12. Meat, fish, egg are good sources. Curd is also a good source because of the presence of something like the lactobacillus that can synthesis B12. Now, let me move on to the daily required element, right? Daily required elements. That is the amount that has to be ingested as far as daily basis. Somewhere around 1 to 1.5 milligram is required for a normal person, and in terms of pregnant and lactating women, 2 microgram per day is required. Now, let me talk about the metabolism part, that is the absorption, transport, and the storage form of this vitamin B12. The absorption of vitamin B12 requires the mediation of something called as the Castle's intrinsic factor, which is a glycoprotein which is secreted from the gastric parietal cells. What is gastric parietal cells? Gastric parietal cells are nothing but the cells that are present in the parietal region of the stomach, uh, where these cells secrete Castle's intrinsic factor. It's called as intrinsic factor by the name of the founder of the so-called name Castle's intrinsic factor came. And now, generally, this one molecule of this intrinsic factor can combine with something like 2 molecules of vitamin B12, and this intrinsic factor and B12 complex get attached to specific receptors and the intestinal mucosal cells, and they are internalized. They are getting transported into the uh, cell, and generally what happens is this intrinsic factor is digested inside this mucosal cell, and this B12 is converted to the methyl cobalamin, and then it is transported to the blood bound, transported in the blood, bound to a protein, that is a glycoprotein, something called as transcobalamin 2, where in excess of this methocobalamin is taken up by the liver and is converted to something called as deoxyadenosyl cobalamin, which is getting stored in the combination with transcobalamin 1, something called as transcorin, deep into the diagram sheeting part, right? Yeah. Now, this liver can store up to 2 milligram of vitamin B12. As a matter of fact, which will be sufficient. This 2 milligram will be sufficient to meet the body requirement of this vitamin B12 for somewhere around 2 to 3 years. Now, let me talk about the functions, that is, the biochemical functions they are involved. There are two coenzyme forms of this vitamin B12, that is the methylcobalamin and deoxyadenosyl cobalamin. Yeah, let me come again. The two forms of this coenzyme forms are nothing but the methylcobalamin. The other one is the deoxyadenosyl cobalamin. Now, there are a set of reactions, that is the metabolic reactions that are taking place with the help of this methylcobalamin, as they are acting as coenzymes, something like in terms of this homocysteine to methionine metabolism by this methionine synthesis. It acts as a coenzyme for this something called as methionine synthesis, where homocysteine is converted to methionine, and it is also required for deoxyadenosyl. I mean, this deoxyadenosyl methylcobalamin is also acting as coenzyme, where it helps in the conversion of L-methylcobalamin to L-methyl malonyl CoA to succinyl CoA. That's also quite deep into the biochemistry thing, as the chemical reactions allied. Now, this coenzyme of vitamin B12 is required for the synthesis of the nucleic acids, and in turn, it is also required for the cell division too. And this also participate in something called as the amino acid metabolism, and also helps for something called as the myelin sheath formation and proper functioning of the nervous system. So generally, the deficiency of cobalamin shows neurological disorders are like the vitamin B9, the folic acid, and these vitamin B12 participate in this fatty acid metabolism to something like the conversion of propionyl CoA to the succinyl CoA, and it also stimulates chemopoiesis. Now, prior to this deficiency symptoms, I would like to say what is hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis is nothing but production of red blood cells and platelets, which take place in the bone marrow. So it plays a huge role. This vitamin B12 plays a huge role. I'd like to talk about something called as folate trap. The cyanocobalamin is required for the conversion of something called as the methyl tetrahydrofolate to tetrahydrofolate by homocysteine methyltransferase enzyme. Now, generally, what happens here is, in case of this cobalamin deficiency, the tetrahydrofolate pool is reduced, and entire body folate is trapped as N-methyl tetrahydrofolate. This is known as folate trap. Once again, quite deep into the biochemistry thing. As in terms of these vitamins, there are these vitamins. Vitamins generally play a key role in terms of all the metabolic reactions. The reactions that are there to produce energy and that are helping to produce energy, in turn manipulate things, Now, let me talk about the deficiency symptoms that could be seen. Something like the pernicious anemia. There is what is pernicious anemia? Pernicious anemia is nothing but the megaloblastic anemia with certain neurological symptoms is called as the pernicious anemia. Okay, now coming on to yeah, once again continuing with this deficiency symptoms, where uh, something called as methylmalonyl aciduria and homocystinuria is quite prominent. Yeah, yeah. Sorry for the interruption. Once again, just a second. Hey guys, sorry for the interruption, and there was certain external factors, external disturbing factors. Now there is something called as now when there is deficiency. Let me talk about the treatment part for this deficiency of this vitamin B12. Generally, this vitamin B12 deficiency is treated by the IM injections of cyanocobalamin. IM in the sense intramuscular injection, uh, generally done by a doctor, or your doctor prescribes something like the oral vitamin B12 therapy. And if uh, generally, if neurological defects are present, then injections will be, I mean, the intramuscular injections will be given every other day for up to 3 weeks or until no further the improvement is noted, something like that. Yeah. Now, what are the symptoms that are seen due to this vitamin B12 deficiency? I mean, the maternal vitamin B12 deficiency during pregnancy or while lactating leads to, as I mentioned, something like the neural tube defects and development delay and failure to thrive. Even anemia and ataxia is seen. As I mentioned, the pernicious anemia, there is the megaloblastic anemia, along with the neurological symptoms that abide by it. Now, what happens when the transporter, that is the intrinsic factor, is deficit? And yeah, in the absence of this intrinsic factor, there is inadequate amounts of cobalamin are absorbed, which in turn results in something called as the megaloblastic anemia. When the root cause of the resultant megaloblastic anemia is absence of or inadequate amounts of intrinsic factor, the condition is termed as the pernicious anemia, which I mentioned. Yeah, I was talk about the treatment part also, and yeah, I guess that's the end of the session. And kindly throw up your doubts, please. Yeah, I guess I haven't mentioned about the functions of this vitamin B12. I would like to mention about it and add up a few ideas about this vitamin B12's functions, where it helps to protect against cancer, including something like the breast cancer, colon cancer, lung and prostate cancer too. And it is required for the healthy skin, hair, and even nails. And it helps in something called as reproduction and constant renewal of the skin. And on the other hand, it is also required for the treatment of this anemia, be it the pernicious anemia or the megaloblastic anemia. And it is and this vitamin B12, it is also it also dramatically lowers the homocysteine, which is a risk factor for the brain shrinkage. So we can say that when the vitamin B12 is supplemented or the its level is maintained, uh, it, it plays a role by something like reduces the brain shrinkage. Yeah, thank you. Now the doubts, please. Some doubt it seems. Yeah, Mr. Akashram, good evening. Can you explain about the absorption of B12 once again? Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Akashram, with pleasure. In terms of this cobalamin absorption, two mechanisms are there for this cobalamin absorption. To be very simple, something like the passive absorption and the active absorption. Where this passive absorption will be occurring equally through the something like the oral or the buccal, duodenal, and ileal mucosa, and it is rapid but extremely inefficient. Quite weird, right? Yeah. And as a matter of fact, it will be somewhere around less than 1% of an oral dose be that will be absorbed by this passive process. And in terms of this active absorption or the active absorptive process, the normal physiologic mechanism is active. Yeah, be something like it occurs through the ileum is and it is efficient for small something like in terms of the micrograms. Yeah, the oral doses of cobalamin uh, in micrograms is mediated by the gastric intrinsic factor or the gastric intrinsic factor, which I mentioned earlier. Where this dietary cobalamin is released from protein complexes by enzymes in the stomach, the duodenum and the jejunum, that is the small bowel and the stomach. And generally, what happens is it rapidly combines with the salivary glycoprotein that is under the family of something like the cobalamin binding proteins, or generally known as the hepatocorins, which I mentioned, which helps for the transportation. Where in the intestine, the hepatocorins are digested by the pancreatic enzyme, that is, to be more precise, the pancreatic trypsin. And yeah, the cobalamin is in turn transferred to the intrinsic factor. Yeah, I guess that answered your question, Mr. Akash Ram. Yeah, there's one more question. Someone named Rabisha Darni. Yeah, good evening, Miss Rabisha Darni. She has asked something like, is there any syndrome due to vitamin B12? Yeah, syndrome of vitamin B12. Yeah, due to this vitamin B12 deficiency, yeah, I mentioned right. With this deficiency leads to the neurological disorders and anemia, and a mild deficiency might not cause any discernible symptoms. I mean, there won't be any prominent symptoms in case of mild deficiency, but as the deficiency become more significant, symptoms like the anemia uh, might be there, which in turn causes something like the weakness or fatigue in the sense tiredness. Yeah, muscle tiredness, and something like the lightheadedness could be seen, and the heartbeat would be quite rapid. That is called as tachycardia in medical term, and the breathing rate also increases. And in terms of this anemia, which causes paleness of the skin. I guess I have answered your question. Thank you, Ms. Ravisha Darni. I guess there are no more questions, and you people are clear on this topic. Yeah, thank you for joining the webinar. And yeah, guys, I guess that's the end of this session, and we'll catch you up soon in the next session. And yeah, maybe by tomorrow 11 a.m. By 11 a.m. Yeah, thank you. Good day.